This section is going to be just a quick and painless recap of your female reproductive anatomy. Let's go ahead and jump right in. I've mentioned this in the program overview that, at least for me, this was something that I hid under my desk during this part of high school anatomy because it was so embarrassing. I think our big opportunity is to begin instilling menstrual cycle awareness. Menstrual cycle pride might be too strong of a word, but menstrual cycle acceptance into the next generation of women, because the earlier that we embrace our menstrual cycle as really being something that is such a powerful tool in indicating our health, the better, honestly, the better relationship we have both with our menstrual cycle and with our bodies throughout our entire life. And the better able we are to connect with our bodies, which is the goal of health. That is, at its core, that is the foundation of health, is being connected with your body and recognizing and understanding that when it communicates with you through a disease, through a condition, through infertility challenges, what it's doing is asking for help and asking for support. And it does this even through menstrual cycle irregularities. And this is kind of this is the canary in the coal mine. This is our first indication, our first clue that something is off balance within our lives. And oftentimes it's as easy as adjusting lifestyle and diet, which we do not give enough credit for here in the Western world. And I know I'm totally off on a tangent here at the very outset of this particular segment on your reproductive anatomy. It is so important. This is the key takeaway for this entire program. This is the key takeaway for any program you find here at Rain Organica, is how important it is. It's like you don't need a doctor to interpret your body for you. You just need to know what your body's telling you. And yes, there are times where we all need a doctor. Most of the time, I would say, if we just know what our body is saying, we're able to avoid long-term conditions, the development of long-term conditions. We're able to, at least to an extent, reverse some of these long-term chronic conditions. And, ideally we'd recognize it before they become chronic long-term conditions in order to help our bodies achieve balance, which is balance presents as health. So, enough with the tangent. Let's go ahead and get into this quick recap of your reproductive anatomy. So we are going to start at the outside of your body and work our way up into your body. So at the very outset of your body, of course, for women, we have 3 different exits to the world. Our urethra, which is how pee exits your body. Your vagina, which is how menses exits your body. And, of course, your anus, how poop exits your body. We're going to be focused on the vagina. So the vagina is that opening to the world. Moving up through your vagina, you come to your cervix. And your cervix is a donut-shaped organ. So it is shaped just like a donut with a hole in the center of it. And it's oriented like this. So imagine a donut sitting on a table surface if, you happen to not be watching the video at this moment. So that hole in the center of the donut is a varying size throughout your menstrual cycle, which we'll come back to. Moving on up through your cervix, you arrive at your uterus. This is where an egg implants. This is where an egg incubates for that 9 months following fertilization. So where fertilized egg implants. Then moving up above your uterus, you have two fallopian tubes extending to either side of your uterus towards both your left and your right ovary. The ovary is where follicles, which are essentially the storehouses for the egg that will be released that month. So egg is synonymous with ovum. So where the egg will be released for that month, and you'll often hear referred to as the dominant follicle or developing follicles. So you have multiple, regardless of whether you have PCOS or not, you have multiple follicles developing in each ovary during each cycle. And at some point, a dominant follicle is selected, and that follicle will develop faster than all of the rest of the follicles, and that follicle will release this cycle's egg. So that is all we're going to do to talk about the anatomy. Now we're going to move into the physiology, which is what is the function. Physiology is a fancy word for function. What is the biological function of each one of these? And again, starting at the outside, your vagina is the channel between you, it's the channel between the world and your body. And so it is really necessary for that channel to be protected. And for this reason, the pH inside your vagina is acidic. And we're going to revisit that concept here in a minute. Continuing to work our way up, we come back to the cervix, and it is the channel between your uterus and your vagina. It's actually the lower part of the uterus. Cervix means neck of the womb, but it's also its own organ, and the cervix plays a key role in reproduction. It generates different types of cervical mucus. You can refer to this or think of this as cervical fluid if the word mucus grosses you out. And I will oftentimes refer to it as cervical fluid. This is borrowed from Tony Weschler, who we'll talk about probably a little more throughout this program, later in this program. Your cervix produces different types of cervical fluid, and these play a key role in helping to select when sperm are able to make it through your cervix into your uterus, where it's even possible for them to fertilize an egg. When your cervical fluid is not amenable to the passage of sperm aren't able to make it from your vagina through your cervix and into your uterus. So, and sperm being very happy in an alkaline, so this is a basic on the pH scale environment, so this is a pH above 7, don't live for very long inside your vagina, which again is acidic, so it has a pH below 7. We'll again revisit this here in a minute. Your uterus is next up inside your body, and it's your womb. It's where those fertilized eggs again plant and grow into babies during a pregnancy. Your fallopian tubes, each one of these, so both your left and your right fallopian tube, are about 4 to 5 inches long, and they have hair-like projections off the end of them that extend towards each ovary. And those hair-like projections, so you can think of these kind of like cooked spaghetti noodles, gather up the egg once it's released from the ovary, so they kind of graze or caress each ovary. And so when that ovary releases the egg, those little hair-like projections grab up that egg and gently pull that egg into the fallopian tube. And then the egg is transported through your fallopian tube by a different type of hair-like projection, very short hair-like projection known as cilia, which line the inside of your fallopian tubes. The ovaries themselves, again, you have 2 of those, and these are the organs that house all of the eggs that you're born with. So from your birth, you have all the eggs you will ever have inside of your ovaries. Now, when we're talking reproductive hormones, It actually starts in your brain. So inside your brain, so any conversation around reproductive anatomy isn't complete unless we also talk about two endocrine glands within your brain. So the first of those is the thalamus, and the second of those is your pituitary. So your thalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone during part of the cycle, well, actually during all of the cycle. However, the frequency at which it releases that hormone changes over the course of your cycle. And what this does is control the rate that your pituitary releases follicle stimulating hormone, so FSH, which you may have heard of, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. And both of these hormones are really involved in your menstrual cycle. FSH for developing those follicles every cycle, and luteinizing hormone for stimulating the release of that egg from the dominant follicle during each cycle. So again, just to keep this short and to the point, we're not going to go into all of those rapid pulses of the thalamus. We're focused here of gonadotropin releasing hormone from the thalamus. We'll focus mostly on your pituitary and the FSH and LH, and that's really where we start the conversation. So the follicular stimulating, we're also going to revisit all of these two that are released from your brain, and also the two that are released from your ovaries, more in the phases of your menstrual cycle module. So that said, we will talk about how estrogen affects your brain. So each one of those developing follicles every month releases a certain amount of estrogen. And as those follicles grow larger and larger, they produce more and more estrogen. And then what that does is it starts this feedback loop with that gonadotropin releasing hormone up in your thalamus, and it changes the tempo at which gonadotropin releasing hormone is released, and this alters the amount of FSH that's circulating in your bloodstream. Now, those growing follicles need follicular stimulating hormone. It's essentially like fertilizer or like food for developing follicles. And so what happens is the estrogen from the growing and developing follicles actually shuts off production of FSH. And so what at the beginning, and here when I say at the beginning of each one of your cycles, so this would be on day 1, the day that you start to bleed, those developing follicles that begin developing in that cycle, again, on cycle day 1, sometimes maybe a couple of days even before you start to bleed, those developing follicles are essentially in a race to outgrow each other. It's a competition to become the largest and the strongest developing follicle. And the reason why that is because the largest and the strongest developing follicles are making the most estrogen, and they're the ones that will survive the longest when the supply of follicular stimulating hormone is shut off, which again is done because each one of these developing follicles is generating estrogen or producing estrogen. So when the supply of FSH drops, that dominant follicle is the only one that's able to survive that famine period of FSH. And then what happens is the luteinizing hormone is also triggered to surge, and that prompts that dominant follicle to release the egg. And at that point, you'll see your LH surge and also your FSH surge. And then that also marks the time that estrogen is no longer the dominant hormone in your cycle. Instead, progesterone takes over. We'll talk about this more in the in the phases of your cycle module. So progesterone has its own feedback loop with your hypothalamus and your pituitary glands. It also, just like estrogen, alters the tempo of the gonadotropin releasing hormone that's released from your hypothalamus. It stops the estrogen luteinizing hormone positive feedback loop, and this is what resulted in that LH surge that made you ovulate. Progesterone also maintains the endometrial lining, and it maintains the corpus luteum, or it is released from the corpus luteum. And what the hell is the corpus luteum? Well, the corpus luteum is, so I mentioned that the follicle is essentially like the house for the developing egg. Well, the developing egg leaves the follicle is still there. However, it's now an empty house instead of a full house. And so at this point, it's known as the corpus luteum. When the house is empty, when the egg leaves, that follicle becomes the corpus luteum, and it switches production from making estrogen to making progesterone. And the progesterone is what maintains the endometrial lining. Progesterone is vitally important to a healthy pregnancy. This is something that we're going to talk about in detail because you want sufficient progesterone. When you don't have sufficient progesterone, it increases your risk both of implantation not happening, so you essentially having a chemical pregnancy where the egg is fertilized but it's unable to implant, or it increases your risk of miscarriage. And so we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how to know when your progesterone is low, and also spend a lot of time talking about ways to support good progesterone levels. So anyways, stay tuned for that. The natural lifespan of the corpus luteum is about 12 to 16 days roughly. And then at that time, the corpus luteum just naturally decays or naturally dies. And at that point, your progesterone levels drop, your estrogen levels have typically already dropped. And that's when within a day or two, you start bleeding for your period. So that wraps up the anatomy, the quick review of your reproductive anatomy. Let's move on to the next segment.